Thank you for coming this afternoon. Let me just make a general comment to begin with. Some of us here are very excellent at the theory and conduct of psychological science, and we've seen that across this convention. Some of us are excellent at translating and applying that science, and that's a very important thing to do. Some of us are excellent, but fewer of us are excellent at communicating and integrating that science into broad-scale policy and practice with governments and at a global level. Richard Bryant, who's the next speaker, has demonstrated excellence across all of those domains: the basic science, the translation, and the policy. My name's Kevin McConkey, and I'm pleased to introduce Richard, who I've known for about 35 years. Richard's commitment to our field and to the well-being of others has been evident, and it's been recognised in many ways across his career. And for those of you earlier in your career, I particularly would like you to listen, because I've known Richard from the beginning to now. So from completing his doctorate in 1989 to his current position as Scientia Professor of Psychology at the University of New South Wales, there's been many steps along that way. From his very first publication in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in 1989 to now some 5 books, 63 book chapters, and 516 journal articles, in case you were counting. And from his very first award, an early career award from the Australian Psychological Society in 1996, to perhaps, apart from today's award, perhaps the most important award in Australia, his appointment as a companion of the Order of Australia in 2016. None of you know what that means, other than let me say that that's the highest civilian award that Australia can give. That record of achievement over the last 30 or so years reflects Richard's research on post-traumatic reactions. These studies have included behavioural, cognitive, genetic, neuroimaging, and social studies. And this research has importantly mapped psychopathological and biological reactions. Also, that record that I mentioned reflects his development of assessment and intervention protocols, the translation of the work, that have been translated in a different way into some 15 languages and are used by a large number of governments, including the US government, and organisations across the world in the aftermath of natural disasters, terrorist activities, wars, as well as in the aftermath of individual events such as severe accidents and personal loss. For instance, Richard is currently working closely with the World Health Organization on the very, very major Syrian refugee crisis, with large-scale implementation programs of his interventions across the Middle East and Europe. As a 2018 APS James McKeen Cattell Fellow, Richard is going to speak this afternoon on Trauma and Society: Why Social Factors Matter for Coping with Trauma. Please welcome Richard to the podium.
Hello everybody, and thank you very much, Kevin. Kevin was actually my advisor for my PhD, as he mentioned, and he wasn't here on the awards night when I said those nice things about him, so let me just repeat it now, because what you need to understand about a key cross-cultural difference between America and Australia is that, like the other night at the awards night, everyone said really nice things about each other, about their mentors and their teams. We don't do that in Australia. We're just basically not nice to each other normally. So I need to make a point while Kevin's in the room here that whatever success I've had, it's the lessons that he taught me 30 years ago as a PhD student. He basically taught me how to play the game. So for that, I am very grateful. Now, I'm not going to talk about the different things that I do. I thought I'd just focus on one focal point that's attracted my interest in the last couple of years, and that is the issue of trauma and society, and social factors and how they help people deal with trauma. Given that it's a Saturday afternoon and it's getting towards the end of the conference, let me just tell you the bottom line at the beginning. My field, the field of post-traumatic stress, essentially pays lip service, I think, to social factors. It's been written about for generations, saying that social support matters and social factors matter, but really, in terms of what we seriously, the attention we give it, both at a theoretical level, in terms of conceptualization, and also operationally, it's very little. And I think it's a missed opportunity, and that's really the point I want to make here. Now, if we go back 50 years or so, people like John Bowlby very much popularised the notion of attachments and how important they are. It's not spoken enough about his original writings. They're really important bits of work. And essentially, he and others argued that from a very early age, we and other species have to rely on our attachment figures as a way of surviving. They feed us, they protect us, they nurture us in times of need. And so whenever we are in need, we have a natural tendency to turn to those caregivers. And obviously, from an evolutionary point of view, we learned, a long, long time ago that if we're going to survive as a species, we have to band together to guard against threats. Now, on the basis of this, we then learned as a species, and other species as well, that we have this hardwired tendency to seek our caregivers. And again, 50 years, 60 years ago, there were these wonderful experiments done. People like Harlow would do these experiments with these baby monkeys, and they'd put them in the lab. And experiment after experiment showed that if you had a monkey and it had a choice between going to the figure on the left, which is a fake monkey, but it was covered in cloth, or the monkey on the right, which was not covered in cloth, but the one on the right actually gave milk. It actually had a functional use. The monkeys always went to the ones covered in cloth, even though it didn't actually give any food. And he argued that what the monkey was doing here was giving comfort contact, which, of course, this was a hardwired need that we have. Now, it is argued that when we're young, we seek our attachments when we're particularly threatened, and as we grow up, we continue to do it when we are under threat. And it's not a surprise if you look at the literature over the last many, many years. We've got a lot of data that tells us that if you actually have social support, it reduces distress, it reduces pain, it reduces things like neural activation associated with pain. But importantly, attachment theory argues that as we grow up, we learn to internalise these attachments. We actually don't need the attachment figure with us. We have mental representations of our attachment figures, and when we're threatened, we tend to activate those representations as a way of actually getting the support that we need. And again, although a lot of experimental work has been done that tells us if you get a person in the lab and you get them thinking about their attachment figure, it actually promotes benefits. And similarly, if you actually promote threat, you threaten somebody in the lab, they will then think about their attachment figures. And this is across a great range of paradigms. So thinking about attachments in the lab, not having an attachment figure with you, but just thinking about them, again, it reduces pain neural networks, reduces distress, it reduces the attentional bias that people have towards threat. But it doesn't work for everybody. And this is an important point, because one of the early notions of the theorists of attachment theory is that if you actually have secure attachment experiences early on in life, then you can internalise those representations and carry that through life. But if you actually have the misfortune of actually having inconsistent attachment figures or abusive attachment figures early on in life, then you develop an insecure attachment system. And these are described in different ways, but to put it simply and a bit crudely, people can either have anxious or avoidant attachment styles. So if I've actually had unfortunate attachment experiences early in life, I may be anxiously attached, in which case I'm very worried about the fact that I'm not going to have an attachment figure available when I need them. Other people, however, might have been so burnt by their unfortunate attachment experiences that they're avoidant. And so they actually deactivate, if you like, or inhibit the attachment system, and so they just avoid attachment figures altogether and become very insular as a way of actually coping with stress, because they've learned that the attachment figure just is not going to be there. All right, that was a very, very quick overview of the theory. Let me talk about some of the work we've been doing to try to build on that, because the question we've been asking ourselves is, given the importance from an evolutionary point of view about attachments and coping with threat, surely this has to be important to how we cope with trauma. And how do we get a greater evidence base about this? Let me start off with the issue of attachment style. We've known for many years through a lot of case studies of orphanages that kids that are brought up in particularly places like Romania and places like that after the war, where they were placed in orphanages and had very abusive childhoods, that they actually had long-term fragmented or disorganised attachment styles. But we wanted to ask the question, what happens if you're a child and you actually have a very brief separation from a caregiver, but during a very traumatic event? And we cashed in, if you like, on a particular design that we had in Australia. Back in 1983, we had a very, very large natural disaster, a wildfire. It was called the Ash Wednesday fires. And a colleague of mine was doing his doctorate at the time, back there in the 80s. And he actually did a big epidemiological survey, assessed many 8-year-old kids and their parents. What we did a couple of years ago was we went back and assessed them again 30 years later. And what we were particularly interested in with this particular cohort was that the fires actually went through on a school day, and it was purely by chance whether kids were with their parents or not when the fires went through. And a lot of people died. There was a lot of devastation. So this is a serious life-threatening event. What we found was that if the kid was separated from their parent during the fire, that actually predicted an avoidant attachment style 30 years later, which also then went on to predict their current PTSD levels. And that was only like one day. Now, I'm not saying that's the only explanation for this. I mean, this could also then have led to a cascade of different parenting styles and all sorts of things that also might have contributed to it. But it's a teasing or a tempting interpretation that just having that brief separation through a very, very intense time of threat can actually threaten one's attachment style. Now, what we've been doing over the last number of years is we've been trying to unpack in the lab some of the basic mechanisms that we know are central to PTSD, and trying to understand how can we play with attachment proximity, attachment priming, to try to moderate the fundamental stress responses that we see in trauma. Now, essentially, what we do is we provide a stressor, or we provide awareness of an attachment figure, and then we measure various parameters. In one of the first ones we looked at, we just wanted to look at the basic effects of stress hormones. Now, we know that in the fundamental response to trauma is that we are going to see glucocorticoid and noradrenergic response. It's going to be, a huge release of these stress hormones, and this is essentially what drives many of the symptoms that we see in PTSD. In this sort of paradigm, and I'll show a number of studies like this, but in this one we took cortisol, we then took saliva, we measured their cortisol and their noradrenergic response. We then just gave them a cold pressor test, as simple as that. They just stuck their arms in icy cold water for 5 minutes. And then, after that, we got half of them to imagine an attachment figure, girlfriend, boyfriend, mum, and half of them imagined another person in their life who wasn't an attachment figure. And then we took the stress hormones again. And essentially what we found was that the people who actually had the attachment response, attachment prime, they had a decreased noradrenergic response relative to the people who got the non-attachment. So just even imagining my attachment figure was able to decrease the stress response in response to the cold pressor. Looking at parasympathetic response, it's explicit in all the attachment theories that proximity to an attachment figure should actually reduce my arousal. And as we know, heart rate variability is a key index of parasympathetic response. So we looked at this in a separate experiment. Same sort of design. We measured their baseline heart rate variability for 5 minutes, gave them a cold pressor, and then it got the attachment prime, or they thought about a non-attachment person. And then subsequently, we looked at their heart rate variability again. And again, we found that the heart rate variability was larger in the people who received the attachment prime. That is, their parasympathetic response, which in a sense is an index of emotion regulation, was enhanced if they were thinking about their attachment figure. Now, what about memories? Of course, when we're talking about PTSD, memories are pivotal, and particularly intrusive memories, because they are, if you like, the fuel that drives a lot of the other PTSD symptoms. And we know that a lot of the models of intrusions are based on the notion that it's the arousal, the stress hormones at the time of encoding a trauma memory that actually then leads to the ongoing intrusions. So we wanted to ask the question, given the centrality of this symptom, can attachments actually impact on the development of intrusive memories? So staying in the lab, we did a similar sort of experiment. We initially had people watch a computer screen where we subliminally presented, just for 17 milliseconds and then backward masked, images of an attachment figure. And normally we do an experiment like that. It's usually something generic like a mother with a baby, or different images, which is simply a single person. And people got one or the other, attachment related or non-attachment related. And then they saw a whole bunch of images that were graphic, traumatic type scenes or neutral scenes. And then several days later, we got them back into the lab and they did memory tests, and we also indexed the intrusions that they experienced over the last few days. Now, what was interestingly, when we actually divided the sample into those that had a secure attachment style and those who didn't, we got different findings. If we just focus on the people with a secure attachment style, if they received the attachment prime, they had significantly fewer negative memories in the intervening days than the people who got the non-attachment prime. But when we looked at people with an avoidant attachment style, they didn't benefit from it at all. It's like whatever they were thinking about, when we asked them to think about their attachment figure, it just didn't sort of give them any benefit. They had as many negative memories as the people who got the non-attachment prime. Now that was intentional retrieval. When we actually indexed the intrusions, same pattern. With a secure attachment, they had far fewer intrusions than the people with a non-attachment. But when you see the avoidant attachment people, not working. It's just not hitting the mark for them. Now, what about retrieval of memories? This is another possibility where we might be able to intervene, because very often we're not going to be able to, prior to an event, at the acquisition or the encoding of a trauma memory, we can't actually make sure that the person's thinking about an attachment figure. But what about when they're retrieving a memory? Is it possible that if I'm thinking about an attachment figure then, can it moderate how that memory is functioning? So what we did in this experiment is we show the images, neutral or traumatic images. Then we bring them back 2 days later. And then they either think about an attachment figure, or because of the impact of mood on retrieval of memory, and it's such a robust finding, the control prime here was not another person, but a positive experience that we asked them to imagine. Then, 2 days later, after that, we then measure their intrusions. And essentially we got the same pattern of findings. When we look at the people who were securely attached, again, they had fewer intrusions if they thought about the attachment figure at the point of retrieval. Avoidantly attached people, no benefit at all. Now, what about memory reinstatement? And this is where it becomes very interesting. Because as we know, that very often, particularly from a therapeutic point of view, it's often when you bring people into a clinic that we're actually going to ask people to think about memories. And as we know from the memory reconsolidation literature, if I'm retrieving a memory, for some period of time it will enter a labile state. And during that state, when presumably there is some form of synaptic plasticity occurring for some period of time, we can intervene. And people have shown us that they can do that pharmacologically or psychologically. So we wanted to ask the question, if we can destabilise that memory and then we activate a person thinking about their attachment figure, what impact is that going to have on their intrusive memories? So what we do is we showed people here a trauma film. And this is a film, actually it's from California, come to think of it. It's of a highway accident here, and it's the aftermath of the accident. So you have paramedics and emergency personnel cleaning up the scene, attending to people who are very badly injured, a lot of blood and guts, and it sort of finishes with them actually pulling a dead body out of one of the vehicles. So it's quite graphic and typically does produce intrusions. 2 days later, these were students, by the way. 2 days later, they came back, and we then activated the memory, and we activated the memory by showing them parts of the film that actually were not the traumatic parts, but enough to reactivate the memory. Also in that session, after we'd done that, we then asked them to think about an attachment figure or to think about a positive experience. So essentially, memory destabilised, reactivated, and then I'm thinking about an attachment figure or I'm thinking about a positive experience. Then what they did was we downloaded on all their phones an app so that they could actually record intrusions over the following days. And what we did was just did not record the frequency of intrusions, but we also asked them to record every time an intrusion happened, how distressed they were and how vivid the intrusion was. We actually didn't find anything in terms of frequency of intrusions, but what we did find, and there was no difference in this study between securely and insecurely attached people, but across the whole sample, we found that those who, when the memory was destabilised and we got them thinking about their attachment figure, they had markedly less distress in the following days of their intrusions than the people who thought about a non-attachment figure. And similarly, when we talk about the vividness, they actually had markedly less vivid intrusive memories than the people who thought about the non-attachment figure. Now, this is an intriguing finding because, in a sense, this is taking us more into the window of what we might do therapeutically. Because targeting the trauma memory is something that we typically need to do. And if we can destabilise the memory and we can interfere with it in some way by using, thinking about social supports, this might provide some mechanism by which we can actually interfere with that process. What we've also been looking at recently is some of the basic fear conditioning, fear response that is really the paradigm that drives so much of the PTSD models. If we actually had to pick anything in the PTSD world that is most influential, I'd probably have to put it down to the fear conditioning models. I think it's without doubt the most prevailing model. So what impact can attachments have here? PhD student of mine at the moment, Metaxia Kokonox, she's done a number of studies, and in one of the very first ones, we just simply looked at startle, some white bursts of white noise. And as you know, this is a very simple, hardwired index of probably amygdala response. And what we found is that if I'm thinking about an attachment figure, I actually suppresses my startle response markedly. When we do a differential fear acquisition paradigm, which is a standard fear conditioning, so after an habituation phase, but before the fear acquisition, before the conditioning phase, they thought about an attachment figure or they thought about another positive experience. Then they do the normal conditioning between electric shocks and different coloured shapes. And then a day later, they come back in for the extinction phase. And essentially what we found here was that people who thought about the attachment figure, they had markedly less fear acquisition than the people who thought about the non-attachment figure. And this persisted to the extinction phase. So it certainly impacts on fear acquisition. Now, what about consolidation of the fear? So what Metaxia did after that was a subsequent experiment, same design, where she gave the habituation phase, then the fear conditioning, fear acquisition as normal, and then after that, when we're in the consolidation window of when that learning should be happening, we then got half of them to think about the attachment figure and half of them to think about a positive experience. Then they come back for the test phase a day later. And essentially what we found was that there was less consolidation of the fear conditioning if I thought about the attachment figure. So it does seem to be able to moderate both the acquisition and the consolidation of the fear conditioning. And this is really important because this is sort of the process by which we understand how PTSD develops in people. And so clearly the next step, and this is what we're working on at the moment, is to what extent does this actually impact on extinction? Because extinction is essentially what we do in therapy. That's exposure therapy. And if we can actually demonstrate that the thinking of an attachment figure can actually augment the effects of extinction learning, then we're really onto something that's going to be quite practical, because it can actually impact on how we can use something in terms of basic learning principles of fear, but by using attachment figures, how can we actually moderate that? And it's interesting, there's been some other recent work coming out of Naomi Eisenberger's lab, where they've actually taken a slightly different approach, but they've actually used social supports as the stimulus by which they are actually conditioning the stimulus to. And they're finding that they get far weaker fear acquisition and fear consolidation if I'm actually trying to condition the person, have the conditioning in association with a social support. And they're arguing that social supports actually inherently provide some form of safety signal because of this hardwired function that it serves in human beings. So I definitely think there is convergent evidence coming to light on this. Now, can we alter attachment systems? This is sort of another interesting question that we should be asking. It's often thought that attachment systems are developed in childhood, and this is essentially the old theory, and that whatever they are, when they are established by our parenting, that's it. We're stuck with it for life, unless you have 45 years of psychodynamic psychotherapy, in which case, maybe it'll change. Now, we know that there's a lot of evidence that insecurely attached people are going to have probably a negative effect, a negative response to trauma. Lots and lots of evidence about that. So if we can actually make insecure people more secure, they should actually be more resilient in the face of trauma. Because there is overwhelming evidence, really, that insecurely attached people are going to respond more poorly. So the question is, can we actually enhance somebody's attachment style? Well, another PhD student of mine, Emma Doolan, has been playing with this lately and just using a very simple approach of cognitive bias modification. Now, CBM is an old approach. It's rather difficult to explain, but it actually comes out of the anxiety literature. It was developed about 20 years ago by people like Andrew Matthews. And essentially it's based on the notion that people with anxiety have an interpretive bias towards certain information. And so somebody who's anxious, if there's ambiguous threat out there, they will invariably interpret it in a way that it is threatening, it is negative. And so what they did was they came up with a process where they could try to train people, and I'll explain what this is in a minute, to appraise those things differently so they would no longer interpret that information in a threatening way, but interpret it in a more objective way or a less threatening way. Now, if we want to interpret or construe attachments as appraisals, so the fact that my partner or my mother or my friend, are they going to be available or are they not going to be available at time of threat? That's an appraisal. So can we train people to actually have a different appraisal based on their interpretive bias? So we thought we would test this using the old cognitive bias modification procedure. So we pulled in 80 anxiously attached individuals. So at my university, we have a wonderful system where all the psych students have to do research credit, and before they do it, we screen them on all sorts of measures. So we gave them an attachment style measure, and so we could select who are those who are anxiously attached. So we pulled 80 of them in. And then we gave them a modification of the cognitive bias modification procedure. And essentially the way this works is this. People read a very, very large number of scenarios, 64 actually, so there's a lot of them. And what most of them are is a scenario that can be completed one way or another way. So in this example here, you realise that you made a mistake at work and you're afraid to tell your boss the next day. You talk to one of your parents about it and they seem to be. Now the participant has to finish the sentence. And depending on whether they're in the attachment prime or the non-attachment prime condition, they're actually given different words to complete. Now the reason we just don't give the word, they have to complete it, that actually enhances their cognitive processing and its greater priming. That's how the cognitive bias modification procedure works. So in this case, if I'm in the attachment condition, I will finish it with compassionate. If I'm in the non-attachment condition, it will be indifferent. Now they read 64 of these. Now embedded in these are a whole bunch of filler ones so that we don't make it bleeding obvious in terms of what we're trying to do. But the people who are in the attachment condition are getting a lot more of these that are attachment oriented, and conversely for the people in the non-attachment condition. And then after this, there's a recognition test. And everyone gets this, and they get a whole series of sentences like you've been let go from your job and you ring your best friend for support. Your friend answers your phone call. Everyone gets this. And these are not ambiguous, they're quite straightforward. But the critical test of this test is a subsequent recognition test where people are then given a series of scenarios with a title that says it's similar to but different from one that you've just read. And it could be something like your friend answers your call and tells you that they can call you back in 5 minutes, or your friend answers your call and tells you that they cannot talk. Now, this is the key. Your job as a participant is you need to rate how similar in meaning the sentence is to the one that was previously listed. And so what this really is, it's more of an implicit measure of the extent to which I'm going to interpret this in a positive way or in a negative way, or in the case of this experiment, in an attachment-oriented way or in a non-attachment-oriented way. So it is meant to be a subtle or an implicit measure of a bias of interpretation. It's a difficult experiment paradigm to explain, but that's the reality. It is complicated. The bottom line is we found that the people who actually were trained in the cognitive bias modification, and they actually endorsed a lot more secure sentences than the people who actually trained in the insecure cognitive bias modification. And conversely, you can see that with the insecure. And essentially what this is telling us is that by training somebody in a way to think in a biased way, we can actually shift how they're interpreting their attachment scenarios or situations. Now, clearly, this is a very artificial environment. We're demonstrating something within the laboratory within a 60-minute period. Now, this is not changing somebody's entire attachment system, obviously. But it's worth noting that in the cognitive bias modification literature, this is how it started with anxiety. And people have taken this outside with anxious individuals into the real world and shifted people's interpretive bias in anxious individuals. So really the challenge for us is, can we take people who are insecurely attached and can we actually demonstrate that, number one, with repeated training, can we actually shift their attachment style? That's number one. And number two, if we can actually do that, does it actually lead to the benefits that we know that attachment priming or attachment proximity can actually lead to? So the things I mentioned before about reducing stress hormones, increasing heart rate variability, decreasing intrusive memories. Can we actually increase people's capacity to benefit from those things by training up an interpretive bias so they have a more secure attachment system? It's a big ask, but in my clinic, we work a lot with grief, which is the ultimate in poor attachments. And we work a lot with people from childhood abuse and other kind of fragmented attachment systems. Now, the extent to which something like this will work with them, it's an empirical question. But I think we just need to start from the building blocks, which is what we see here, to see what ground we can make. Now, let me shift gear enormously and say that one of the criticisms I do have about the trauma field in particular, when it comes to this whole notion about the role of social support, is that it's always banging on about the importance of community. And yet there's hardly any ever research done that actually takes a more community perspective on how social support and social factors actually work. And in essence, what nearly studies always do, and there's dozens and dozens of them in the literature, where they'll talk about social support or they'll talk about community integration, but they're always asking individuals what they think. And so essentially we're getting an individual's appraisal of what their community is. When really what we should be doing is catching up with other disciplines and taking a more sociocentric view. Now, this is not new, social network analysis. There's been a number of talks at this conference about that. And social network analysis has been around for a long time. In psychology, it's far more prevalent in things like organizational psychology. It's very big in business, in management, for obvious reasons, because that's what they're interested in. It's big in economics. It's actually a relatively new kid on the block when it comes to mental health. And essentially what social network analysis is it looks at the relationships between, in the jargon of social network analysis, between nodes or actors, which is just their jargon for people. And it doesn't just look at what is happening in that individual. It looks at a whole bunch of people. It looks at their characteristics of that individual. But then, importantly, it looks at who is linked to whom. And then it looks at how are those characteristics between these individuals impacting or being impacted by other people within that social network. Now, what you end up doing when you do a social network analysis is you end up with a significant number of people, and you can actually then do a social mapping exercise where you put them all together. Now, let me give you a case study of a natural disaster that we had in Australia. This was nearly 10 years ago now. It's actually the worst disaster we've ever had. It was a big wildfire that happened in the state of Victoria. It affected nearly the entire state, killed nearly 200 people, massive property damage. And what was interesting from a social network point of view is that the regions it affected were tight-knit rural regional communities. So there were people who knew each other. And whenever you're going to do a social network analysis, you've got to actually work in a group of people who actually know each other, or you don't have a network. And what we did is we came in about 4 years after the fire, and we did your boring old epidemiological study. You know, we asked everyone about their depression and their PTSD and the sort of things that everyone does after a disaster. But importantly, we also did a social network analysis. And this is where it got interesting. We asked everybody in the study, think about your life at the moment, and is there a person or organisation you feel particularly close to? Do you provide assistance or emotional help and support to anyone? Did you receive practical assistance or emotional help from anyone? Now, what we would do in a study like this, we would go around and ask everybody all these questions, and everybody was asked to provide up to 10 people each. And we would ask for each of those 10 people, who were they, what are their name, what's their relationship to you, where do they live, what's their address. And the reason we get all of this painful detail is that at the end of the whole thing, we need to do a social mapping where we can link everybody in the network to everybody else. So it's quite intensive to do, but it means you've got a great social network. Now, we ended up with over 1,000 people, and about nearly 2,500 had what we would call emotionally close ties. And, you know, just looking at a bird's eye view, what we could see here is that you've got a fair number of people who are loners. These are the dots down the bottom. And then you can see you've got these groups up the top who are very in tight-knit relationships. But to sum up the major finding from this study at the moment, let me just focus on depression and PTSD because they were two very different and divergent results. We found that the more I was saying I've got connections to other people, like I'm sending ties to other people, then the less depression and the less PTSD I have. Well, that makes sense. We've known that for donkey's years. If I say that I'm receiving more help or more connections from other people, I also have less depression and less PTSD. Again, that makes sense. But the next one is interesting. It's what we call potentially contagion. And essentially what we found is that the more depressed people were, the more they had ties to other depressed people. Now, there's a few ways to interpret that. It could be that depression is actually contagious. That's a possibility. People's down moods are just getting other people down. It's also possible, though, that depressed people are just hanging out with other depressed people. It could be that misery loves company. Or it could be that there are third variables that are causing people to hang out together, and those same variables are causing people to be depressed. We don't know. But what's interesting is we didn't see that in PTSD. What we did see in PTSD was the next row, where we see that the people who, the risk for having PTSD increased. If you knew people, but those people did not know each other, then the likelihood of you having PTSD went up. But if you knew people and those people knew each other, then your likelihood of PTSD came down. And essentially what that's saying is that if I'm part of a social network that is intact, then that is protective against having PTSD. But if I'm part of a social network, but it's a fractured social network, then that's not good. My risk factor goes up. Now, what's interesting is that we've actually done a longitudinal study of this. I can't present the data yet, we're still analysing it, but we went back a couple of years later and we've asked all of these questions again, including the social networks. And in the social network world, that's what you've really got to do, because we can actually exclude some of these possibilities in terms of interpretation by actually focusing on controlling the baseline variables and seeing what's actually predictive of the wave 2 data. What's also interesting about the social network analysis in this study is that we measured everybody's attachment style. So we can actually map onto this people's secure attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, to see how does this actually moderate it. And we are actually already seeing some very interesting data coming out there, differentially even between genders, between how people who are avoidantly attached, to the extent to which they actually are engaging in social networks and not. But the point I'm really trying to make here is that I think it is useful to move into this space of social network analysis if we're really going to try to understand how are these factors happening, particularly after something like a mass disaster. Because if you're talking about an earthquake or a hurricane or something like this, by definition they affect communities, large numbers of people. And by focusing on the individual level, we're actually missing out on a lot of important data. And that's important, not just for theoretical reasons, but also for policy and planning. All right, time's running out, so I'm going to wind up. So the points on what I'd like to make here is that social attachments, they do matter. There's so much data coming out beyond the clinical world. To be honest, where most of this evidence comes from over the last decade or more has been social psychology, which has really sort of led the way here. But if we actually take a lot of those paradigms from social psychology, social experimental psychology, and apply them to the mechanisms that we see underpinning trauma response, we can actually see, why this is so relevant. What we're doing at the moment on that score is working out to what extent do they actually apply to the clinical populations. So a lot of the paradigms I've explained today, we're busy in the clinic. Basically everybody who comes to my clinic, everybody with PTSD, they're going through a lot of these paradigms. And we're priming attachments or not to see to what extent thinking about attachment systems, to what extent can they actually moderate the stress response and moderate the memories in people with PTSD? Because really at the pointy end of things, that's really what we need to be trying to demonstrate. As I mentioned, trauma can damage the social networks. So can we actually keep building on this strengthening of someone's attachment style, attachment system? Can we make them more secure? That is always going to be a good thing. It's a big ask. I'm not sure if we can or not, but it is worth trying. And the other thing that I think is really worth noting is to what extent can we blend this in with treatments? Anybody who's a clinician, you know that our treatments aren't bad, but they're not great. So everybody's trying to say, how can we increase our hit rate in doing treatments? Given you've got something so fundamental and universal as attachments as a way of people dealing with stress, can't we actually harness that mechanism, build it into treatment, and try to get a better treatment response by using attachment systems either actually or symbolically through just thinking about it to try to augment what we can already do in treatment. And we're also playing with that in terms of future work. So I will stop there. It's 5 to the hour. We're meant to finish on the hour. So I'll take some questions if there are any. I insist on a question. Yeah.
My voice is loud, not that loud. What do you think is the role of empathy or compassion in this potential contagion model that you were describing earlier?
I've never thought of that. It's an interesting question, the role of empathy and contagion. One way to answer it is that we do know that in terms of certain attachment styles, if people are too enmeshed, it is actually not a healthy thing. And so the empathy can actually become excessive. And we've certainly seen this I didn't present this data, but we've done some dyadic studies in this bushfire study where in certain relationships there is a negative impact on one partner on another, which is essentially due to their attachment style, with the one person's depression bringing the other person down in particular. So I think that's one sort of example where that can sort of be brought in, where it can be a negative. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could you give an example of the brokerage situation you talked about, increasing or decreasing likelihood of PTSD? One where it's disconnected or a complete.
Well, it's quite simple that if I'm somebody and I know Fred and I know Joe, but Joe and Fred don't know each other, that's not a good risk for me. But if Joe and Fred are friends, then that's actually protective. And it's just suggesting that, there is actually a community. There's a social network there. Yeah.
Quick question about exposure in the disasters. Some people really are exposed to horrendous things. Others are exposed to less horrendous things. How do you think about that, and how do you control for the kind of heterogeneity in life-threatening or impairment or loss during that kind of experience?
Well, let me just answer that in the context of that. Are you talking about the first fire study or the second one in particular?
I'm just wondering how you handle the heterogeneity of exposures within.
Right. We always control for it. We always have sort of objective indicators. So, for example, in the social network paper, we control for it, and we used objective indicators in terms of low risk, medium risk, high risk, and that was objectively determined by loss of property, etc. So if I was in that region, as well, we have subjective reports of I was directly threatened, and so that's always controlled for before we get onto the other predictors.
Thank you. And you eclipsed our ability to applaud this wonderful talk, so will you let us do that after this is over?
I'll think about it. Yeah. You had a question? Yeah.
It might be a bit hard but if people die into the social network, so I wonder whether that affects depression, because it's likely that people who are friendly with other people also know people who are likely to both know somebody who died in the fire.
Yeah, one of the very interesting things about that study, which was a pity, basically the people who were directly bereaved, none of them took part.
But that assumes that, first of all, the relative died, but somebody who died in the community, I think that would have a huge impact on everybody in that network.
Oh, sure.
And it might be with people who, a parent in the school died, and so all of the parents who know each other and therefore in that network also knew the person who died, and they're more likely to, and I think it's possible to really do impact on depression, but perhaps less so on PTSD.
I'm not sure if everyone heard that, but I think it's a valid point that, which I didn't make, is that the PTSD and the depression do operate very differently on a number of levels. And I think the point you're making is a good one, that certain events such as loss or awareness of loss or proximity to loss, that could actually have a generic effect on a group of people. And these actually were like towns where everybody knew each other. And some towns in particular were just particularly devastated. But I think the other interesting thing about the depression versus the PTSD is that, you might think about depression, particularly because of its mood, it can actually have more of a contagious effect on other people. PTSD can be more insular. It's my problem, it's my memories, and so it may not be as transparent, if you like. in that sort of dispersed mood effect. Yeah. Now, it is 4 o'clock. There's another session starting elsewhere that personally I would like to go to. So I think I'll call it quits. Thanks for coming, everybody.